بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا كما ينبغي لجلال وجهه العظيم، ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الذي بعث رحمة للعالمين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحبه المنتجبين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. عظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصاب أبي عبد الله الحسين عليه الصلاة والسلام. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليكم مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، وجعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Sisters and brothers, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. عن علي عليه الصلاة والسلام إنه قال: اللهم إنك تعلم أنه لم يكن الذي كان منا منافسة في سلطان ولا التماس شيء من فضول الحطام، ولكن لنرد المعالم من دينك ونظهر الإصلاح في بلادك، فيأمن المظلومون من عبادك وتقام المعطلة من حدودك. O Lord, you know that if we rose to accept the challenge of leadership, it was not to wrestle for power or eagerness for some material benefit. It was to bring back and re-establish the principles of your faith and to reform social structure so that those who have been wronged feel safe and the discontinued commandment to be reinstated. Khutbah 131. Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salamu alayhi in this sermon, which was delivered to outline the reason why he accepted the leadership or Khilafah after the death of Uthman. Here he makes a distinction that the trapping of power has no value for him whatsoever if he couldn't use it to establish justice and to reintroduce the forgotten principles that have been departed from the Muslim community. The social structure that was left after the demise of the Holy Prophet has to be reinstated. Otherwise, power, Khilafah per se, has no value to Imam. And when Ibn Abbas comes to see him one day while he is busy mending his slippers, and he says, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, this slipper is very old. Why don't you change it? You throw it around, get a new one. He said, Ya Ibn Abbas, holds the slipper up. How much do you think this slipper is worth? He said, nothing. He said, I swear by God, the leadership and the Khilafah over you for me is less valued than this slipper. But if it wasn't for the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us, when the opportunity comes to establish justice and protect society, one has to accept it. So that's the reason. And it is not surprising when Imam Hussein salawatullah salam alayhi starts the journey, he borrows exactly the same narrative, the same khutbah, and reintroduces it to tell the society around him that his goal, objective, is no different from his father. As we see it in the text, Asiru basirat jaddi wa abi. So he reintroduces the same concept. That Muawiyah was not there, Yazid is there, so still the process, the society has not changed, still he is obligated to go through it. Last night, I tried briefly, within a short space of time that we have, to introduce on the first part of our discussion the concept of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar and its critical importance. I introduce an idea that Amr bil Ma'ruf should be contextualized within the frame of reference, the fact that we as human beings have to live in society. And living in society requires some kind of rules, values, norms, ethical and moral principles to dictate and govern the behavior of individuals. You cannot live in a society without such frame of reference, without clearly the goods to be defined and the bads to be avoided. And Islam talks about this, what people ought to do as ma'ruf, and what people have or ought not to do as munkar. And then there are a number of verses in the Holy Quran that commands the believers, male or female, that they have an obligation to make sure that this principle is adhered to and implemented in society. Otherwise, society is going to be corrupted. وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهِ, as the verse I recited last night, لَهُدِّمَتْ. The social fabric of the society is going to be destroyed if there are no groups of people that would take it upon themselves to implement what is good and prevent what is bad within the society. Wa alaikum salam. Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar can be designated into some kind of on a personal level and a collective level. On a personal level, there is a different principle and different strategies, but on the collective level, the commanding the collective good and forbidding the collective evil necessarily requires having some kind of a power structure in your hand. Without power structure, collective good cannot be furnished and collective evil cannot be prevented. That's the social structure. In addition, this is why Amirul Mu'mineen salawatullah salamu alayhi says, to establish justice, the commandment of that collective good, I accept the responsibility of Khilafah. Khilafah, which is the power base, I need it so that within the context, the framework of the Khilafah, the power that Khilafah gives me, I will be able to establish the collective good and forbid collective evil. Not only we have from our ahadith, few of them I narrated last night, Al-Amr bil-Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar qawamu ad-din wa sharia. If Amr bil-Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar is not done, the basis, the foundation of Sharia is shaky and there is no stability within the Sharia. So you need to do it. In addition to that, there is a verse in the Holy Quran, for us to become khayru ummatin ukhrijat linnas, Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar is a prerequisite. Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas, under what circumstance? تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. It's not God-given. You can pay lip service to Ummah Muhammadiyah, but you don't have any authority, any power, as we see ourselves in the world. 1.8 billion population around, and we are the weakest community on earth, collectively. We are being tossed around by anybody that has a little bit of power. Everywhere we go, the same thing. Why? Because for us to become a powerful ummah, the concept of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy al Munkar is necessary. The collective commandment requires power, and we don't have it. How can you change society? Unfortunately, people think these days that you can become a member of this party or that party, represent in the state capital, or that's it, that we have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 representatives, we have power. No. Remember the first night we were discussing this? Unless we create our own narrative, and propagate it to everybody else, we don't have power. If we follow somebody else's command, there is no power. We have Muslims that become member of the Republican Party and they follow the narrative of the Republican Party. We have Muslims that become member of the Democratic Party, they become the same thing. No change. So the active command, تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ, requires that we as Muslims acquire the power so that we can prevent and change society. But on the individualistic, I said there are differences, different strategy, different approach. Now, when it comes to concept of Amr bil Ma'ruf, or even interpretation of history, reading of history, Karbala in particular, we have one of the most challenging problems. And that is, either we look at Karbala as finally the culmination of a continuous process of challenging struggle of Imam Hussein and Ahlul Bayt that ultimately represents itself in what we call open confrontation, which I call it a holistic approach. We look at the life of Imam Hussein. Let's be frank. Imam Hussein wasn't born on Rajab year 60 after Hijrah, year 5 after Hijrah, or 4 after Hijrah. So by the time he reached Karbala, he was close to 57 years old. What do we know about this 57 years old? What did he do? He didn't come out suddenly challenging Yazid. Was quiet, pacifist during the life of Muawiyah. Unfortunately, when we look, we discover Hussein on the Rajab of year 60 after Hijrah. When we discover Zainab, we just heard the Na'i, we would discover Zainab on the day of Ashura a few days before. We omit 55 years, 56 years of active jihad and struggle. And we are challenged how to answer the questions that we have. Questions that, for example, why did he leave Mecca and Medina? One of the questions. Why did he choose Kufa in the light of the dysfunctional social fabric that existed in Kufa? Why didn't he accept Bay'ah? Why didn't he say anything during Muawiyah's time? Why didn't he go to Yemen as Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, his half-brother, and Ibn Abbas advised him? What was the motive and the strategy for the uprising? What was the goal, etc., etc.? We list all these questions. We have problem understanding or finding answers for these questions because we discover Hussein from Rajab 60 after Hijrah, and we search for a solution within 6 months, forgetting all the years before. But the holistic approach doesn't look at life of Hussein within Rajab to the beginning of Ashura or Muharram 61. Goes back to the beginning. Looks at the ground. What did he do during the period of the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah wasalam alayhi? When he was the example, the role model. And it wasn't once we look at it holistically, it's not a spontaneous reaction that suddenly Muawiyah died, Yazid came to power, suddenly Imam Hussein decided that he's going to challenge Yazid. And then we are going up with a list of questions to answer. The holistic approach, and we call it the khawas and the elite approach, finds Imam Hussein, if we pay attention, never stopped working for the social reform. The strategy was different. Once all other avenues failed to deliver the social foundation, what we call today in the political narrative, the political base, then Imam had no other alternative to move towards what we call open confrontation. On every occasion, even during the life of Imam Hassan, although he was the Imam and he followed his brother, but nevertheless he keeps sending letters to Kufa, to Basra, to other places, even to Muawiyah, reminding him of his responsibility. 1 year before Ashura, during the life of Muawiyah, he goes to Hajj. And in Arafah, he delivers a sermon. Now huge amount or numbers of what we call the scholars of the day are present. And because of his position, they come forward, he delivers a sermon to them. What does he say? وَأَنْتُمْ أَيُّهَا الْعِصَابَةِ. You see the language? Isaba, it's a derogatory term used to denigrate, not to elevate the position. The scholars of the time, إِصَابَةٌ بِالْعِلْمِ مَشْهُورَةٌ. Yes, you call yourself scholars. وَقَدْ تَرَوْنَ عُهُودَ اللَّهِ مَنْقُوضَةً. And you can see it on a regular basis, the commandment of Allah being violated. فَلَا تَغْضَبُونَ. And you don't even move. فَمَكَّنْتُمُ الظَّلَمَةِ مِنْ مَنْزِلَتِكُمْ. You gave, literally allowed the tyrants to control your affairs. وَأَنْتُمْ أَعْظَمُ النَّاسِ مُصِيبَةً. You are the biggest liability for Islam. Hoping that such a stark language and a stern language would shake them. Nothing happened. Imam Hussein rises, comes to Mecca, Hajj goes on, the scholars come, nobody mentions anything about that Imam Hussein has a movement. Medina is silent, and they pay a price. Imam Hussein was martyred Ashura, Muharram 61. 63, the revolt in Medina starts. And Qiyam, people of Medina, year 63. What happened? A year after 62, a group of people from Medina, they decide to go and see, okay, what's going on in Mecca, in Sham, to establish it for themselves. They didn't listen to Imam Hussein. They go there, this group of people that had within them major Sahabas that abstained from supporting Imam Hussein. They came back. They said that he's literally kafir, alcoholic, is not worthy of khilafah, etc., etc. And they kicked his wali, or the person who represented him, out of Medina. Within a short period of time, Yazid sends an army of 12,000, 13,000 people, encircle Medina, and totally destroy it. They paid the price. There is a verse in the Holy Quran that says that when the wrath of Allah comes, it would not distinguish between those who committed the sin and between those who are silent, and even if they did not agree to it. Why? Because they didn't stand up to it. So it came down, and they had to pay a price. Kufa abstained. What did they do? Harakat al-Tawwabin, a year later, 64 after Hijrah. They had to sit down and reflect. What did we do? That because they preferred material, the here over the hereafter. Remember in the story of Muslim, in beginning of Salat al-Maghrib wal-Isha in Masjid al-Kufa, according to historians say between 80,000 or more or less people were within the prayer. Masjid was full. By the time the prayer was over, Muslim looked around, he was by himself. And mothers used to come grab the hand of the sons or the family members and pull them out. What do you have to do with this? Leave Muslim, they will settle the differences. This is the mindset when Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar is not there. The same people that turn out on the day of Ashura selling the sword to Ibn Sa'd and Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad and everybody else. 2 years later, they have Harakat al-Tawwabin. They all wiped out. Until 66, Mukhtar comes and avenges some of the crises in Ashura. Imam Hussein knew that with the absence of the what we call political base, he has to create one. And he started sending letters around. The idea that Kufa sends a letter with signatures, huge number of signatures to Imam Hussein, is in response to these kind of letters that Imam sends around to Basra, Kufa, and everywhere else. It wasn't as if, and even his letters to Muawiyah condemning him. So Imam Hussein wasn't silent. But the strategy was that he's going to move from one phase to another of resistance. It was an ongoing resistance until he reaches a point where the concept of, hoping that people, whether scholars, whether Sahabas, whether people or anybody else will stand up. This is why he said, الناس عبيد الدنيا والدين لاعق على ألسنتهم. Enslaved to material, and they pay lip service to the faith. So long as what? The faith does not intrude in their comfort zone and asks them to do anything. So what we have as we're getting close to the end of time, there are three, I mentioned it at the beginning of the discussion. The original division of the society, there was no Shia Sunnis per se. It was two narratives. The Alawi narrative on one side and the Amawi narrative on the other. Once the Karbala uprising took place, all of these two narratives tried to explain this or find a rationalization within it. The Amawi narrative introduced the idea that this was only some kind of desire to grab power. Nothing more, nothing less. But the Alawi narrative divided itself into two. Number one, the group of people that what I call more or less they are ignorant and the simplistic approach to the uprising. Well, Imam Hussein rose, and we still listen, if we listen to some of these khutbah, you hear it. That he said the last minute before he left Medina, he went to visit the Holy Prophet's grave, and he somehow fell asleep, saw a dream. Then when Ibn Abbas comes to him, he says that, Sha'Allah an yarani qatila wa an yarahunna sabaya. That's it. That's the simplistic approach. So the attack against Hussein's uprising is not just from the Amavite narrative, it's within us. The simplistic approach that they interpret both of them, Ashura and Karbala uprising, in a manner that remains purely locked up in the past history, has nothing to provide for us today. Despite the fact that there are a huge number of slogans within the uprising that we can use and learn from it. ألا إن الدعي ابن الدعي خيرني بين اثنين بين السلة والذلة وهيهات من الذلة. That's one principle that doesn't need Muslims. The notion not to accept humiliation and preserve your dignity is a principle that can be used. لا تكن عبد غيرك وقد جعلك الله حرا or خلقك الله حرا. Be free thinker. On the day of Ashura, just before his martyrdom, when the army moved towards the tent and he was still alive, what do we hear? يا شيعة آل أبي سفيان إن لم يكن لكم دين ولا تخافون المعاد فكونوا أحرارا في دنياكم كما تزعمون. Be critical thinker, be free, think freely. This is a concept that we can introduce in our society without wrapping it within what we call the traditional Shia culture of commemoration or everything else. You talk to anyone to be a free thinker, inspired by this. اللهم إني أحب المعروف وأكره المنكر. Last night I talked about it. The first step is that we should love ma'ruf and hate munkar. Embody it within ourselves. And ألا ترون إن الحق لا يعمل به. Again, another concept that we can present in our discussion. Now, one thing that we really need to remember, this type of interpretation and reading of Karbala leaves us with huge amount of principles and moral values that we can implement in our life, and Ashura becomes a role model for us. When Imam says, when it comes to Yazid, مثلي لا يبايع مثله, doesn't say I will not submit to Yazid. Mithli, those who are following the same principle, those who are critical thinkers, those who are free, those who submit to the command of Allah, those who understand ma'ruf, those who understand munkar, they are not going to submit to such a vile individual. Even if we were to accept كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء, the universal message. So to wrap up, we really need, when we sit and listen to people, khutaba and speakers presenting it, think, is this reading and presentation puts Ashura in history 1,400 years ago without having anything to contribute to our well-being today or not? I'm not saying they are not correct. No, that's an interpretation. But what we need is a unique understanding of Ashura that makes it a living reality, that we deal with it, learn from it. And unfortunately, we have failed. When I was in Canada in 1996 in Montreal, there was a conference in Ottawa organized by the Khoja community about Fatima al-Zahra salamullah alayha. A number of leading scholars within Khojas came to give a speech. After the speech was over, the presentations were over, one lady stood up, young lady, and had a critical question. We keep talking about, quote unquote, life of Fatima al-Zahra is this, Fatima al-Zahra is that. Fatima lived 1,400 years ago. It's past. It has no relevance to now. This is a Shia young lady. Fatima lived 1,400 years ago. Past, and it's irrelevant in our time. We are dealing with different kind of challenges and struggle. Who's responsible for it? Us. when we keep presenting the life of the Imams in a manner that belongs to 1,400 years ago, naturally the younger generation, they don't see anything in common with it. Ashura is another example. If we discover Hussein from Rajab 60 up to say Ashura, beginning of Ashura or Muharram 61, without looking at the life of Imam Hussein, and inshallah, Dr. Hussein, when the last night when we talk about what happens next, the same question applies with Zainab sallallahu alayhi. We have no clue about this, the second major individual that worked hard for the success of Ashura. Ashura can be divided into two parts. The first part ends on Ashura, the 10th day of Muharram. The second part begins from that afternoon until the message is delivered in Sham. And we suddenly discover Zainab. We have no clue what did she do. She was the child after Imam Hussein, 1 year younger. So by the time she came to Karbala, she was 55 years old, if not older. What happened to these years? What did Zainab do? So when we need to wrap up, what we need to reflect on Ashura, when we see a presentation, a reading of Ashura, let's step back and ask ourselves, does this reading interpretation opens Ashura to assessment, continuous assessment? Our mind at the moment is limited, and this is our understanding. Who knows? 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later, the same ideas are being presented and assessed, but different reading comes out of it. Constantly, it gives that dynamism to the Shia community. Or is it simply capturing it and locking it up 1,400 years ago and say, okay, that's an historical event? If we do it that way, then our children say, well, so what? What do we learn from it now? Why should we listen to these tragedies all the time? Constantly repeated. As I said, the consequence of Ashura, literally, those who propagated Ashura immediately after the demise of Imam Hussein and the ending of Ashura were Ahlul Bayt themselves. Although they expressed the emotion for the tragedy that took place, Imam Zain al-Abidin in particular, but Imam Zain al-Abidin immediately got into action to create that political base that was absent. The way he did it was unique. First, presented everything in the context and narrative of prayer, munajat, Sahifa Sajjadiyya. If you spend time reading it, it's not just dua. And secondly, sending individuals, buying slaves, freeing them, teaching them, and sending them around. Each one becomes the scholar within a community, creating the base, the political base that was necessary for Tashayyu' and the Shia ideology to spread around. Because there was no hope from the existing community, neither the Sahaba or the scholars. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us learn from Karbala, inshallah, and to implement these moral values and principles that we learn from this uprising in our lives. May Allah bless you all. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.